Hello, everyone. Good to have you today. Welcome to the first of our 4 workshops, seminars, whatever you want to call it, on board interaction, and board education. It's important that you understand the importance you are to our collective here in Kentucky, especially around higher education, but moreover, exactly what the future of Kentucky holds. I know you all know who I am, I think, Aaron Thompson. I'm the president of the Kentucky Council on Postsecondary Education, and I welcome you. Also, please understand that as you know, we do the Trusteeship Conference every year, every other year. This year, we decided to really highlight the importance of all the things that are going on in our nation and in our world, especially those items that is of concern to you as a board member. And I'm proud to say that in these next 4 seminars, we're going to have some top-notch people that represent exactly that knowledge we want to share with you. Later on in one of these seminars, you'll have Bill Willing as an example, who's the president of SAC COC. But today, we're going to have a good friend of mine, someone who's worked with Kentucky for a while, and someone who, by far, in my opinion, is one of the most knowledgeable people about what's going on, not only in higher education, but how higher education really has an impact on the positive things that can happen in our society. So I'd like to welcome to the stage, if you will, Jamie Merisotis, who is an internationally recognized leader in higher education. His work is really big and wide. I mean, his understanding of exactly how you can use philanthropy to help move the agenda is one that I'm sure you've heard about, hopefully you've read about. His human work is public policy. He's been president of Lumina since 2008, and before that he served as the president of a nonpartisan DC-based Institute for Higher Education Policy and the executive director of a bipartisan national commission appointed by the president and congressional leaders to study college affordability. He is also an experienced board leader, which makes his contribution today that much more significant. And Jamie, I just want to thank you personally and from Kentucky and from the higher ed folks in Kentucky for your work with us over the last decades. And I appreciate you being here, sir. The stage is yours.
Well, thank you so much, Aaron. And really, I'm very, very appreciative of this invitation. And I've really been looking forward to it. And, the truth is that's in large part because I think that our visions and our goals, the goals that have been expressed formally in Kentucky by the Council on Postsecondary Education and I think more broadly by the state's policy and higher ed leaders and the goals that we at Lumina Foundation espouse, I think they have a lot in common. And this vision that's been articulated in CPE's current strategic agenda, which runs to 2030, is that, and I'm quoting here, Kentucky will be a national leader in building a strong, sustainable, and equitable economy through increased educational attainment and affordable, high-quality post-secondary programs. So in my presentation to you today, and very much looking forward to your questions later, I think you're going to hear a strong echo when I tell you that Lumina, which is an independent foundation that's committed to making opportunities for learning beyond high school available to all Americans, is very much focused on those same goals. We're aimed at preparing all Americans for informed citizenship and for success in the global economy. And back in 2008, Lumina proposed a goal for the country, not for ourselves, that 60% of Americans have a high quality degree, certificate, or other credential by 2025. Adopted by 48 states, including Kentucky, which set its target at 2030. Since 2008, the number of Americans with a degree or a credential has increased from 38% to some 54%, figures that I'd note nearly precisely mirror the progress that we've seen in Kentucky. So, I've been saying that this increase represents one of the greatest examples of shared social success in American society over the last 2 decades. It's been achieved by a tremendous partnership that involves policymakers and presidents, trustees, business and civic leaders, and philanthropy. And, I also know from personal experience what the transformative power of education is. And if you don't mind, I'd like to tell you a little bit about myself because, my parents were working class people and they were deeply rooted in our Greek immigrant community in Hartford, Connecticut, where I grew up. And, neither of them went to college, though they believed very much in the values of learning. And I was really fortunate, frankly. My parents didn't really know what college was, but they worked extremely hard to make sure that my three brothers and I all went. They could see the pathway to a better life, not for themselves, unfortunately, because they never fully made it to the middle class, but for their children. And they committed everything that they had to make that happen: time, energy, and the very modest resources that they were able to save. I like to say that the commitment to learning that my parents expressed helped end poverty in the Merisotis family forever. Now, my alma mater, which is Bates College in Lewiston, Maine, a city that tragically has been in the news this past week, Bates instilled in me the values and ideas of one of its most influential alumni, Dr. Benjamin Elijah Mays. Now, many of you know that Dr. Mays was a minister and education reformer, having led the Atlanta School Board through desegregation. As president of Morehouse College, he mentored hundreds of Black male leaders in our nation, including Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And, Mays delivered the eulogy at Dr. King's funeral, and his life and work had such an inspirational effect on me and my wife, Colleen, that we named our firstborn child in his honor. Now, in Dr. Mays' autobiography, which is called Born to Rebel, which was published 50 years ago, he offers this astonishing roadmap both to the era through which he lived and I think to the coming times. And I just want to give you this quick quote because it reflects Mays' view about his own experience at Bates. He said, Bates College didn't emancipate me. It did the far greater service of making it possible for me to emancipate myself and to accept with dignity my own worth as a free man. Now, I think we know what Mays means in the modern context: free to choose, free to explore, to think, free to prosper. That's what Bates did for me, as it has for thousands of students, and just as I'm sure it did for many of you, wherever you attained your post-secondary degree or credential. First-generation learners like me, and I'm sure many of you, go through life feeling like that they can never really fully repay the place that transformed their life, as Bates did for me. But I tried to pay it forward as a Bates board member for 14 years, and now as an emeritus trustee. So I understand the role that many of you serve at both public and private colleges and universities all too well. Like you, I have a passion to ensure that a new generation can benefit from the extraordinary opportunities that I was frankly lucky to have achieved. Luck, though, I think we can all agree is a terrible strategy. And that leads me to the leadership and strategic insight of CPE and its dynamic leader, Dr. Aaron Thompson, who I know are making a difference to thousands of Kentucky students and their families. I found that Aaron and the entire CPE team don't just talk a good game. They don't just study problems. They move forward on strategic solutions and collaborate well with policymakers and institutions to solve pressing problems. Well, it's one of the reasons I think they set up this webinar series. And so frankly, I think every state could use more leaders and champions like them. Now, I might be biased, but I believe that what we are trying to do together has never been more important for our individual and our collective prosperity. Clearly, this is a pivotal moment for Kentucky, for American higher education, indeed for the nation as a whole. Despite the bounty that springs from higher education, things like advancing knowledge and innovation and building a strong workforce and fostering national prosperity, reducing inequality, uplifting communities, helping individuals live fulfilling lives. Despite this bounty that is so clearly described in the long-term strategic agenda that the Kentucky Council put forward, no one, I think, is telling this proactive story in a thoughtful, consistent way. We know that higher education is the surest route to the middle class and to state and national success. But that message, frankly, is up against some strong headwinds. Today, some 2.5 million fewer Americans are enrolled in college than in 2011. The college going rate of high school graduates dropped from 70% in 2016 to 62% in 2022. In Kentucky, barely half of high school seniors who graduated in 2020 enrolled in college the following year. At the turn of this century, the U.S. ranked 5th among OECD nations in educational attainment. Today, we rank 12th. And a recent Gallup poll found confidence in higher education at an all-time low, with only 36% of Americans saying that they have a great deal or quite a lot of confidence in higher education. That's a 20 percentage point drop from 8 years ago. Now, in addition to these alarming trends, we're seeing most of the conversations about higher education focus primarily on its challenges, which, to be sure, are many. They range from rising costs to racial inequities to uneven career preparation. But frankly, how we talk about this matters. Big data research supported by Lumina on media narratives shows that while positive stories about higher education frequently go unheard, damaging narratives often move from the fringe to the mainstream. In fact, these damaging narratives about higher education now account for a significant part of what people hear and talk about when it comes to higher education. You know, it's easy to fixate on the problems, in part because we recognize that those problems have to be addressed. At the same time, we, and by we, I mean all of us involved in this important and noble work, we need to make a much more forceful case for what higher education is for. We know that the demand for college educated talent continues to exceed the supply. We also know that differences in economic growth across regions, nations, states, cities, and counties are almost exclusively caused by differences in educational attainment. We know, as University of Montana President Seth Bodnar wrote recently, that higher education is a critical component of global preparedness and competitiveness. Bodnar, who some of you may know was a Rhodes Scholar and a Green Beret, says that when he led soldiers in the Army, quote, "I did so knowing we possessed not just air superiority, but also night vision, sensing, and communications capabilities that far outpaced our adversaries. Technology that came from foundational research at American universities and the knowledge workers they produced. Our technical edge is being put to the test around the world today as much as any time in the past 75 years. You know, we also know the severe toll of not having higher education. You know, the Hechinger report succinctly described it this way. People without education past high school earn significantly less than those with bachelor's degrees and are more likely to be unemployed and live in poverty. And they're more prone to depression, live shorter lives, need more government assistance, pay less in taxes, divorce more frequently, and vote and volunteer less often. New research by Ann Case and Angus Deaton, the two Princeton economists who coined the term deaths of despair, referring to the rising number of Americans dying from things like opioids and alcoholism and suicide. Their new research adds, I think, an exclamation point to this argument. The research reveals that the gap in life expectancy between Americans with college degrees and those without has surged to over 8 years. So this is a staggering figure. Again, according to this research, Americans with college degrees now expect to live 8 years longer than those without. College degree holders gained 5 additional years just over the past 3 decades. But for those without college degrees, life expectancy peaked around 2010 and has been falling ever since. So clearly, this is an unfolding disaster that has attracted too little attention in the media or among elected officials and policymakers. Now, the good news is that Kentucky is working to tackle these issues head on. My colleague, Courtney Brown, our Vice President of Strategic Impact here at Lumina, likes to say that the key to moving the ball forward is to focus on the outcomes that ultimately matter. This is one of Kentucky's, I think, great strengths. The state's attainment goal of 60% by 2030 truly drives a strategic agenda for higher education. The state is working to ensure a strong connection between higher education and the workforce. And you're also steadfast in your commitment to equity, which I'll talk about in a moment. Now, at the heart of all this is addressing students' needs, which starts with understanding today's students. You know, they're not 18. They're not fresh out of high school. They're not going to college on mom and dad's dime. Today's students are older and more diverse than ever. Nearly half are first-generation college goers. Half pay their own bills. Nearly 2/3 work in some capacity. and about a quarter are actually raising their own children. Some 39 million Americans have started college but stopped short of a degree. So most states won't reach their attainment goals without reaching that stopped out population. Reaching these students requires what I call a three-legged stool strategy, which is that the lived experiences of the students always has come down to the fact that in real time, they're dealing with three things at the exact same time. Now, these three things that students must grapple with at the same time are financial challenges, academic challenges, and social, emotional, or personal challenges. And the problem with many of our strategies, many of which, frankly, are very well intended and effective in their own right, is that they tend to focus on one of the three legs of the stool more than the other two. So we need a holistic approach to the lived experience of the students in real time. We've got to be able to answer convincingly and effectively the many students who tell us, look, not only am I worried about paying for college and getting my Pell Grant and getting more support, but I've got a job and I've got to deal with childcare and there's mental health issues. And by the way, I'm struggling with my math class or my English class. All of those things are happening at the exact same time. And these problems exist both for students already in the system, as well as for those students who are thinking of entering the system. So thinking about that three-legged stool, the academic, the financial, and the social and emotional issues in a more holistic way, I think is really important. And frankly, when I look around the country, it's hard to see anyone who's doing that really well, but I think Kentucky is doing a lot of things right. For example, the council's policy audit project, which I would say, want to note that Lumina proudly supports, brings together institutional leaders, faculty researchers, and state agency staff to examine how students are experiencing access to public benefits. Over the course of 9 months, the collaborative leveraged student-level data and the power of convenings, paid faculty to conduct qualitative research, and ultimately uncovered bottlenecks that drove low participation rates and SNAP benefits among eligible students. They brought their findings and recommendations to state leaders, and as a result, the Kentucky Department of Human Services announced that it would place benefits navigators on each college campus to better advise and serve students. There's still more work to be done, but I think this is a good illustration, an example of the power of collaboration to identify and break down barriers. In July, another council initiative, the Kentucky Student Success Collaborative, released its report on addressing student basic needs and outlines 8 recommendations to assist college students struggling with the lack of affordable food, housing, and other necessities. Similarly, Kentucky was one of the first states to take on the mental health crisis coming out of the pandemic, providing institutions with funding and technical support. These efforts are just the kind of things that I'm talking about when I say we need a holistic approach. But all of these efforts won't gain traction if we don't address the elephant in the room and a major concern for Lumina, and do more to close ongoing racial gaps in attainment. Now, clearly, we're experiencing a backlash against equity efforts that represents a threat to political, social, and economic power and the demographic change that the U.S. will see becoming a majority-minority country in about 20 years, a backlash that I think is as fierce as any since the Civil Rights era. Lumina's research shows that half of white adults have an associate degree or higher, compared to about 1/3 of Black adults and even fewer Hispanic and Native American adults. This generally matches what we see in Kentucky. Now, while closing these gaps is among the most urgent tasks for higher education, unfortunately, we're going in the wrong direction. For example, data shows that not only was Black enrollment down by 22% between 2010 and 2020, it's fallen another 7% since then. So despite the recent Supreme Court cases and other efforts to push back on equity, Lumina is focusing on redoubling our efforts to ensure a more fair society, and we urge everyone engaged in higher ed to do the same. Now, Kentucky is doing a lot of this, something that I know Aaron takes a lot of pride of in his own work. Lumina State Policy Team has partnered with the council on 2 equity-focused projects in the past 5 years, and Kentucky has been a leader among states involved. Equity drives the funding formula for public college budgets and student financial aid, and the council has adopted one of the most comprehensive diversity, equity, and inclusion policies in the nation. It requires campuses to implement actions to increase enrollment, retention, and completion of minority students, as well as improving cultural competence among members of the campus community. To quote from the Council's strategic agenda, through an unwavering focus on diversity, equity, and inclusion, Kentucky's post-secondary system will work to ensure that income, race, ethnicity, religion, sexual orientation, or geography are never a barrier to college success. I just want to applaud this commitment because I think we have to rethink strategies to ensure that we are inclusive and help people understand the benefits of racial diversity on college campuses, benefits that accrue to all learners. Just as we must do a better job of making the case for the critical role of higher ed in society, we also have to make the case for fairness and inclusion on our college campuses. The words and tactics we use might have to change, but our collective commitment to improving fairness and justice in higher education must not. Let me just single out one more area where Kentucky is putting its focus and I think needs to continue to up its game, and that's adult learners. Again, one more quote from the strategic agenda from the Council. The need to engage substantially more adults in post-secondary education and training is essential to creating greater economic opportunity and social mobility for more Kentuckians. The fact is, over the past decade, total undergraduate adult enrollment in Kentucky has decreased by almost 50%. Declining birth rates during the Great Recession and a drop in immediate college-going rates among traditional age students mean there are fewer people in the post-secondary pipeline. Kentucky ranks 35th in the nation in educational attainment, the educational attainment level of its workforce, and at just over 56%, Kentucky has one of the lowest workforce participation rates in the nation. Clearly, this depresses economic development, it limits knowledge economy job creation, it curbs social and economic mobility, and it reduces enthusiasm for credential attainment beyond high school. Now, I think the Council is focused on reaching those adults, particularly adults between the ages of 25 and 39, when people are typically most interested in career advancement, by working on strategies around accessibility and around institutional change and around partnership. This is an important issue for Kentucky and the entire country, in my view. So clearly, for all of us higher education advocates, let me return to where I started. I think this is a pivotal moment. An increasing number of voices are saying that higher education is no longer worth it. We have to push back on this notion forcefully. Higher education has been one of the foundations of American greatness. It remains the foundation for a prosperous Kentucky and for a prosperous nation. Our job is to continue to make that case while also ensuring that everyone has the opportunity to develop his or her unique abilities throughout life. By preparing people to develop and unleash their full potentials, I think we can instill hope and confidence in ourselves, in our communities, and in the future of our democracy. So thanks for a chance to offer some comments, and I'm looking forward to your questions and your own ideas. Thank you.
Thank you, Jamie. Once again, you delivered exactly what we asked you to deliver, and I appreciate that. A couple of points you made, and I'll just point it out in summation. Then I want to introduce you, my colleague, to be able to ask you the questions that people have put in our question and answers, as well as some other questions forwarded to us earlier. But a couple of points you made that I think it's important for these board members to understand. Kentucky, we are doing a lot of good things, but we consider this just as a part of a continuous improvement cycle. There's a whole lot more we have to do. And there's still wide gaps, especially in adult learners, low income, and still in our underrepresented populations. But overall, in all of us connecting higher education really with the workforce participation and the outputs that we need in Kentucky. And I think it's important for board members to understand that you all are key to this. You are the fiduciary governing bodies of these institutions where the rubber meets the road. I mean, we at CPE, we're policy, we set the agenda, and you all buy into it with your plans, but as it is applied to really do what is needed to be done, you guys are truly the engine that's going to drive all of these efforts. And so, Jamie, I appreciate that. I would like to introduce to you, though, the person that will be asking the questions and facilitating this. my partner in not crime, but in good stuff, Lee Nimitz, who's our Senior Vice President and our Chief of Staff. Lee, I'm going to let you take it from here if I could.
Well, thank you, Dr. Thompson, and thank you, Jamie, for joining us. I think you gave us a lot to think about, and we have gotten a couple of questions from the audience. Let me start with this one. Can you give us 3 or 4 recommendations on what we can do to address the headwinds facing post-secondary education that you mentioned in your comments?
There's a lot of things to be done. So I'm not a believer in what do people call that, the magic bullet strategies, but I believe that a collective group of strategies can be brought together to actually address a change at scale. One of the things that I think, and speaking specifically to trustees, that we need to spend more time talking about is what are we preparing people for? As I said, this is one of the big issues that I think we are confronting. And one of the reasons why I think these headwinds have been so strong is that we haven't done a good enough job to better explain to people what we're preparing them for. In my view, and I wrote a book about this a few years ago, this moment where technology is sort of changing everything that we are thinking about when it comes to work, we've got to do a better job of explaining how we are preparing people for human work, the work that only humans can do. And here I think this is going to require some reform on the part of what we're doing. So, both in speaking to the fact that we prepare people for human work meaning things like being able to be ethical and to be compassionate and to be empathetic, to be able to do work where you actually work in a team and you communicate with other human beings, all of these things that are different than simply a machine doing something and a human doing something. These are cases where humans combined with technology can actually conduct work more effectively. I've been talking a lot about AI in the last couple of years because of my book. And one of the things I've tried to explain to people is that the risk isn't that the robot, that the technology, that the AI, the risk isn't that the AI is going to take your job. It's that the person who knows how to use the AI, who knows how to work with the technology, is going to take your job. So that's one important thing, is to prepare people to do a better job of helping to prepare people for that human work where you need to know about technology, but as the human, you need to bring your human traits. The second thing I think we need to do a better job of, in my view, frankly, is in making sure that we actually focus on preparing people for the work that's in front of us and for the work that's coming. And here I think we have some challenges in higher education because we tend to speak a language that is internal. That's a language that's about our own operation and functioning that I think has challenged us. So one of the things that I've been talking about much more recently is this idea that, one of the things I think we need to focus on is the fact that many times when we talk about majors, for example, about what people how we structure the institutions, often means that people equate that with what their job is going to be, right? And so our disciplinary areas, you've got people who are working in, let's say, philosophy or psychology or education or mathematics. It doesn't mean literally that those people are going to become philosophers or mathematicians or psychologists. It means that they've got expertise in that area that allows them to apply that across a wide range of fields. And, this is what I mean about human work, which is that we've got to do a better job of preparing people for work where human interaction takes place. And so, I think a lot about the fact that, when Steve Jobs was alive, he would often tell this story about taking a modern dance class when he was at Reed College. And, he said at the time that he didn't think it had any practical value. But then, before he founded Apple, he was working at Atari. Those of you who are as old as me remember that Atari is the company that made Pong and some of the earliest video games. And he said that the sense of movement that he learned in dance and choreography was a big influence on designing those video games. By the way, he also credited a calligraphy class that he took for inspiring some of the fonts that they developed at Apple. The point is that these are the kinds of things that you learn. You learn holistically, you learn in broad context, and that can make a real difference. And that's something I think we need to better explain. The third thing that we need to do, and I'm speaking specifically now to our role as trustees, is that we need to make sure that we are focused on the outcomes of the institution, high quality outcomes, high quality learning, making sure that our graduates graduate with knowledge, skills, and abilities so that they can do well in work and do well in life. Be clear about what those outcomes are, those learning outcomes, and how they apply both to the work and the life context. And maybe the last thing that I would point out that we can do to push back on this is to be clear that, as I said in a recent talk that I did, as challenged as higher education may be because of all the things that I mentioned in my talk, high costs, racial inequity, challenges with connection to the labor force, the only thing more challenging than higher education, or the only thing more challenging than not having a college, than having a college degree is not having one, right? So the ability to actually produce more effectively high quality degrees is incredibly important, because people without post-secondary credentials do not do well in the labor market. They do not do well as community and civic leaders. Those facts that I pointed out in my speech are really important. So yes, the system needs to be reformed, but let's make sure we focus on the ways in which it needs to be reformed, because it matters more than ever.
Well, thank you. And I'm going to shift gears a little bit. We got a question that asks, what are the greatest barriers to equity at colleges in Kentucky? You mentioned the Supreme Court case that came up recently. Are there other ways that we can remedy some of these issues in Kentucky and at the local level?
Yeah, I think part of what's happened in the debate over equity is that the debate has become a sort of reflection of our broader political dynamic of there are two camps, and people tend to sort themselves into two camps. But here, I think equity is something that has a much broader support than I think many people understand. Equity in the sense that when people talk about equity, to me, I think what they're talking about is fairness, that everyone should have an opportunity to learn, and therefore to apply that learning and be successful in work and in life. And lots of Americans agree with that. We've worked with a partner called Public Agenda. This is a sort of a public polling and information firm that has worked on a project for a number of years called the Hidden Common Ground Project. And what they've tried to figure out, their starting point for their research, is not to reveal where Americans are divided, because we know a lot about that, but where they actually agree when it comes, and particularly to our work in higher education, where they agree about what should come next. And there's some interesting things in the Hidden Common Ground research, and I think are a starting point for this conversation about how we can actually address equity on college campuses. So one interesting outcome of it, by the way, which I think is a surprise to some people, is that the vast majority of Americans think we need to spend more money on higher education, that funding for higher education is inadequate for the needs of students or of the system, which I think is really interesting and surprising. And that holds true. The research breaks down Republicans and Democrats, people who identify as liberal, conservative. That is true across ideological and political lines. So 3/4 of Americans support increased state funding for universities and colleges. I think that's super interesting. And so one way to get into this conversation on campuses about equity is to say, well, what are we trying to achieve? Well, we're trying to achieve fairness, but the problem is the system isn't fair for some students. It's not fair for low-income students. It's not fair for adults. It's not fair for students of color. Not fair for first-generation learners. So speaking to the issues of fairness and saying the investment needs to be targeted on those learners is one way to do that. I think another is to spend more time in the dialogue across lines, whether it be racial lines, economic lines, social lines, and using the power that we have on our college campuses to drive that dialogue. I mean, these these campuses in Kentucky, every campus in Kentucky is both a place where knowledge transmission takes place, but there are also places where knowledge development takes place. And knowledge development occurs when people work together, when they collaborate, when they speak to each other, and they find common ground. And the colleges and universities can do that in their own context, right? So students and faculty and staff, but they can also do that in their communities where they're located, where they're doing their work, which I think is really important. And we've spent a lot of time and resources at Lumina trying to invest in our own strategies that actually increase equity and equitable attainment by trying to improve participation for students of color, by making sure that we drive success for the students that get there, and that we make sure that we target that success for students when they graduate on careers and on a life path where they actually can be successful in work and in life. So that's really important. But I do think that avoiding the topic of equity is a mistake. I think this is something that I've seen on a lot of campuses, which is that because it's equated with a sort of political dimension that it's hard for people to talk about, you've got to engage in these conversations, that they're too important. And I think seeing yourselves, your campuses as hubs for that kind of dialogue is really important.
Changing gears a little bit more, we have a question about the business model of higher education and how it is evolving or should evolve. So the question is, in your opinion, does the business model of higher education need to change? Specifically, some institutions are moving away from the high tuition discounting and performing tuition resets. What are your thoughts on how transformations like this can help or hurt higher education?
Yeah, I do think the business model has reached a sort of the current business model has sort of reached a natural conclusion. So I would argue that the business model served the institutions and the learners well for a long time. But the problem now, if you sort of look at the top line, right, which is that the tuition levels are high. They've increased at a rate above the rate of inflation at most institutions of higher education in this country for a number of decades. So these are not short-term changes. These are long-term challenges. I was writing about the challenges of affordability in the early 90s. And so this is something that I think is really important to acknowledge. Yes, the business model does need to change, and it needs to change in several ways. One is that I think we've got to rethink the approach to budgeting. Budgeting, I think, when we start the budget process, I think we have to start at what are the outcomes that we are trying to produce as a college campus, as an institution in the coming year or in the coming decade, whatever the time frame is, and build budgets based on the outcomes that we're trying to produce. And then you use that budgeting to then say where the resources going to come from in order to meet that. And too often what we do is we do incremental budgeting, right? Which is that we build on top of what we did last year and try to figure out what we're going to do next year based on the ongoing activities. So it's a little like the old zero-based budgeting, but not really, because what it is it's an outcomes-based model, very much with a performance-based funding model from the state for the public institutions behind that, I think helping to drive and facilitate that. So that's one way to change the business model. The second, frankly, is to be much more analytical and to use the resources, the power of the trustees and the leadership coming together to actually figure out, where the areas of inefficiency are and make sure that you focus either on deciding that inefficiency isn't worth it or how you make that more efficient because you've decided it's a part of your value system and really important. But thinking about efficiency, productivity, effectiveness, all of those things together, I think is a really important part of rethinking the business model. And I would look at innovations around thinking about new tuition models, finding ways to sort of set pricing at different levels, by the way, to redesign the curriculum so that there's more opportunities for learners to achieve different kinds of credentials and stackable credentials over time, that I think is really important. So, being more student centered, seeing the institution as being in service to the learners, and then driving the business model around that idea, I think is a more productive way than simply saying, we are who we are today, and what we want to be tomorrow is this. And in order to do that, we need X plus this amount. I don't think that's the way we're going to be able to drive this business model going forward. And I think it's going to require a rethink about how we think about both budgeting and allocation of resources moving ahead.
I'm going to go back for a minute to our conversations about diversity, equity, and inclusion and belonging. Yeah. We have a question sort of asking specifically where these conversations should land as part of the board and governance structure. So what committees should be taking these issues up, and how should boards in particular be addressing them?
Yeah, I think I'm a firm believer in noses and hands-off governance. So it's a really important principle that I've tried to practice as a trustee, as a board member. I've been a board chair and board member for dozens of organizations and institutions in my career. But I think it's really important to work with the leadership to state this as a part of the value system, and then to engage, I would say primarily at a sort of tactical level on boards in areas like the academic affairs kind of committees and the finance committees as the two areas where you can both talk about it in terms of the educational content, the curriculum, the quality of the institution, and then talk about it from a resource allocation perspective in terms of, what do we want to put our thumb on the scale of, and how do we do that? Those are the areas that I would focus on. But I do think that this has to be a collaborative model. I do believe in shared governance. And I think being inclusive about those conversations, so that when decisions are made, as trustees must do, they must make decisions. Those decisions reflect wide input and benefit from the wisdom of a wide array of stakeholders. But I do think it is a legitimate area of engagement for trustees, and I would encourage more of it going forward.
You referenced artificial intelligence earlier in your comments, and we have a question about perhaps elaborating on that, specifically as it relates to the campus community and the effects that you see of AI on teaching and learning moving forward.
Yeah, I didn't know anything about artificial intelligence until 2018, 2019, when I started working on this book that came out in 2020, and spent a lot of time understanding what I was most interested in is the question of what are the things that are going to impact what education is for, and how will we in higher education need to change in order to better meet the needs of society, meet the needs of individuals. And what I realize is that artificial intelligence is the next wave of technology that has the same kind of potential impact as the internet did when the internet was launched, and that is it will impact everything, right? And so, in 2019, if you ask somebody the question, "What is artificial intelligence?" they talk to you about robotics, right? They could sort of see, lots of people have watched those Boston Scientific videos on YouTube of these incredible robots and their human movements. But artificial intelligence has always been about things like the natural language processing, the large language models. It's been about robotics. It's been about the automation of systems. There's lots of ways in which artificial intelligence has been applied. And I think part of what we're seeing now is these technologies come together, and it's the combining of these technologies that I think has the transformative impact. So, again, I had seen earlier versions of large language models of generative AI going back to 2020. When it finally was released, I think somewhat haphazardly through ChatGPT, I think it was a breakthrough moment for society to realize that AI is not some sort of long-term science fiction-y thing. It's real, it's here, it's now. But at the same time, I think that we have to do as we did before, which is not assume that the technology is simply there to take away human jobs, to displace humans in what they do. It's there to help humans do things better. And this is why I think our learning systems need to adapt so that we don't think, how is the human going to stay ahead of the machine? It's how is the human going to work with the machines in this. And one of the people I talked to in the book is a robotics head from Berkeley. And he said, this is about human machine complementarity. And this idea that what machines are good at and what humans are good at are different. And what we've got to figure out is how we better prepare humans to be more complementary to what the machines can do using their own unique capabilities as humans. The things I mentioned earlier, critical thinking and problem solving and empathy and ethics and all those things in order to be able to apply it on the campuses. I will say that AI will probably be more disruptive than prior waves of technology have been, because there are so many things happening simultaneously in AI. There's a lot of activity going on in AI. And I think the ways in which we'll see that emerge in very short order, literally the next year or two, I think will be challenging. But again, it's our responsibility in higher education to see AI as something that we've got to adapt to and address. I was really surprised. This is a year ago now, in the very early days of ChatGPT, some college campuses seeming very flat-footed and not knowing what to do about it. And in some cases sort of saying, well, we're trying to limit that. That's never going to be a good strategy for higher education. It's figuring out both how we adapt to it, but also how we prepare people for it, that I think is really important. And you're certainly seeing a lot more of that now than you did, last November or December. But I think more of that is going to need to be done.
We've got one more question, and this has to do with the perceived trend towards book banning, censoring instructional topics. The question is it realistic to expect that higher education would lead by standing up for freedom of thought and expression in scholarly environments at all levels of education?
Higher education has always been about freedom of expression and freedom of ideas. And my view about higher education is that it must stand up to these efforts to limit access to knowledge, to drive people towards certain content or perspectives. It is one of the hallmarks of our system. It is one of the hallmarks of the belief system that I think we've long had and long shared when it comes to American higher education. And I do think that things like trying to limit access to certain kinds of information or promote certain perspectives ultimately is a failure. Free speech is something that is embedded in our Constitution. It's something that I really believe in. And I believe that free speech is something that our college campuses have to promote. Our college campuses also have to do a better job of distinguishing between free speech and hate speech. That's something that's also come up recently. And I think it's really important for us to make sure that our campuses become centers for dialogue, for collaborative conversation, not simply as places where people can use the campus to express ideas around hate and extreme views that I think ultimately harm the collective value that comes from learning. But yeah, I believe very strongly that we have to embrace the dialogue again, not run from the conversation, but actually use our campuses as places where we defend the right to learn. We defend the right to have access to information that is different than what we believe, different than what we think, and help facilitate the learning process so that people better understand what to do with things that are that are different than what they believe or what they know. To me, that's what our institutions are really all about.
Well, thank you, Dr. Merisotis. I am going to turn things back to President Thompson to close us out.
Thank you.
Jamie, there's so much I want to say it. I know we don't have a lot of time to say it. And I want to ask you one more question before I close this. You said so much, and trying to put this all together, I think it's you did a lot in an hour. I just appreciate that. But there's a lot for these boards to consider as they go into this next edition, if you want to call it that, of higher education, and truly in partnership with not only us at CPE, but with the communities, with the business and industry partnerships, with our K-12 folks, to think about how we all work together to get all the places that we know we're going to have to go in order for Kentucky, once again, to keep thriving. So my last question to you before I thank you for taking your busy time and sharing with us what you have is, what would be the one last thing, you're not ready for this question, I didn't give you a heads up, one thing you would want to leave these board members with for them to understand exactly the importance that they have in this overall endeavor that we all have?
Aaron, if it's okay, I'll sort of return to my my own experience as a trustee and the experience that I had I've had the privilege of serving in the role that many of the people participating today are serving in. And I'm just thinking about I mentioned in my comments that I served on the board of trustees at Bates College in Maine, and it was one of the most profound experiences of my life, honestly. And I think we all serve in these roles because we cherish that opportunity. And I think in our trustee role, we have to see ourselves as both caretakers and risk takers. In other words, we are both supporters and we're antagonists. Keeping those ideas in tension, that we are here to show great care to these institutions, but we need to press them to change, to meet the needs of society, to meet the needs of coming times, is really important. And when I retired off the board at Bates, they allow everybody to give a short little speech. And one of the things that I said to my fellow trustees is that all of us who serve in these roles, at the end of the day, we can never lose sight of who we are here to serve. You cannot lose sight of the fact that these students, these learners, are the most important reason that we're here. And everyone who comes through this institution that you are serving has to be given a chance to succeed, has to be given a chance to make a difference in their own life and the life of others. And to me, remembering who we are there to serve, I think that is extremely important because you and I both know that the world is changing very rapidly, and lots of things are changing and will need to change on our college campuses. But let's make sure these students are at the center of all those decisions.
Thank you very much, Dr. Merisotis. Once again, you hit exactly where we need to be thinking here in Kentucky. I will also leave you with this one point that you made more than once in this conversation. That's the value of higher education. And the idea that we're going to have to become a better choir, if you will, all of those who believe in that, to let other people know who are not getting that. Our college going rate in Kentucky is low, and it's been lower going for the last 10 years. And we also know the direct correlation between a highly educated workforce and a thriving economy, and also a group of citizens that can civically engage in dialogue. But we are a haven of learning. I mean, that's what higher education is. It's about higher thought, right? It's higher dialogue. It's the ability to critically evaluate and creatively output. So we should know the difference between hate speech and freedom of speech. And we should be pushing one and not the other. However, we have to also understand that we have to work with constituencies all around the nation here in Kentucky, no matter who they are, whether it's political entities or families who are out there struggling with the idea about whether they can afford to go to college. The idea that what we are here, and I tell people, if you think of a college campus truly as a society, I mean, some of the smartest people ever to exist will reside in that society. How can we together bring ourselves, those who are in positions of power, together to understand how to capitalize on that knowledge and to spread it out to others? So I will ask these board members, along with what I think you challenged and charged us with, to think about how we now can work together to not only move us forward, but also help other people understand the value of what we do and how we move people forward. So thank you once again, Dr. Merisotis. I look forward to seeing you again in many other settings. I appreciate the time, and I'll talk to you soon. So now we have, Heather, if you wouldn't mind putting up that slide, if you could. I want to talk a little bit about what is expected from us the next 2 or 3 meetings.
Yes, one moment, my apologies. I don't seem to have it pull up, but
Well, if you can give us the dates and times of our next ones, that would be great if you have that in front of you.
yes, I apologize. Yes, we have 3 more webinars, and the first one, or this was the first one. The next one is on November 16 at noon, in which Dr. Carol Cartwright will be talking about the principles of trusteeship and giving some of those basics. On November 30th, we're going to have Dr. Belle Whelan from Sachs. And then on December 14th at noon, we're going to have a legislative panel.
Wonderful. Thank you, Heather. You will also be getting an email from us following up on this, and you will hear a lot from us. But I want to offer ourselves up to you. If there are questions or any other items you want to talk to us about, please feel free to get hold of me, Heather, or Lee Nemix, and we'd be happy to answer any questions you may have. Once again, I want to thank you for attending this webinar, true enough, but I want to thank you for the service that you're offering to the Commonwealth of Kentucky. This coming season, we'll be working with the legislature and the governor's office to get funding for higher ed, funding we so dearly needed. And we are also going to be working once again to create a continuous improvement cycle, especially around student success, financial transparency, all of these items that I know you are concerned with. So once again, thank you and have a good rest of the day.